Locals and travelers alike stroll by Marion Square in downtown Charleston in South Carolina, and they may not even think about the large slab of what looks like gray concrete enclosed in an iron fence.
It's about the size of an overturned commercial refrigerator.
Few know that this is actually what remains of a massive 18th century fortress that straddled what is today busy King Street.
That's a story that I think even most Charlestonians today don't know the full extent of.
That's David Duncan of the American Battlefield Trust, just one of the experts I enlisted to help further contextualize this significant site so often missed by passers-by. We're uncovering the history of Charleston's hornwork and learning about the Siege of Charleston in this podcast, going on location to Marion Square Park, named in honor of Revolutionary War icon Francis Marion.
So the hornwork at the time of the American Revolution is this massive fortress that's approximately 10 acres in size.
Dr. Nic Butler, a historian with the Charleston County Public Library, is taking us for a walk to take a closer look at what remains. Carl Borick, the director of the Charleston Museum, is also meeting us in Rag Square to shed further light on the Siege of Charleston.
Major part of the American defense line ran through here. The Siege of Charleston was the largest battle fought here in South Carolina during the Revolutionary War.
And David Duncan of the American Battlefield Trust is sharing new developments that travelers can look forward to experiencing right in Marion Square Park.
And Darley, I swear I would be very surprised if people aren't lined up around the block to get their chance to look through this thing.
The Liberty Trail traces Revolutionary War history throughout the state of South Carolina at national parks, national forests, churches, battlefields, museums, and more. There are quite a few good restaurants on this route too, including in the great city of Charleston. And if you listen to the end of this podcast, I'll be giving a few of my personal tips for where to dine. We're sharing key Liberty Trail locations in and around Charleston in this podcast to help you plan your trip. I'll use any chance I can get to head to Charleston for a visit. It's one of my favorite cities, especially when we're on a quest to dig deeper into history, including the tumultuous American Revolution, when Charleston saw the likes of military leaders like Francis Marion, otherwise known as the Swamp Fox, and a siege in 1780. In March, General Charles Lord Cornwallis descended on Charleston. By early April, British forces had taken the city. I'm meeting Dr. Nic Butler in Marion Square to take a closer look at something called the hornwork. We take a walk across the grass, heading towards the hornwork.
And this is just one small piece. Think of like an elephant's toenail and trying to visualize what an elephant looks like from this little hunk of tabby that doesn't really tell us very much.
And tabby is comprised of oyster shells.
Right, so it's kind of pourable cement. Or concrete that was used commonly in South Carolina in the 18th century. So you take oyster shells and bake them down to lime powder and sand and use crushed oyster shells as an aggregate. And you've got a kind of concrete slurry that you can pour into a mold and build structures out of.
Today we have this beautiful Marion Square Park right here, but take me back during the time of the American Revolution. What did the hornwork look like?
So the hornwork at the time of the American Revolution is this massive fortress that's approximately 10 acres in size, and half of that, the eastern flank of it, is here in Marion Square, and half of it is on the other side of King Street. King Street was the only path in and out of Charleston. So the hornwork was straddling that main path and controlling traffic in and out of the town. And that's really why it was created, to control access to the back part of Charleston in case the enemy sailed up the Cooper River or the Ashley River, disembarked, and marched back down, which is exactly what the British did in 1780.
Measuring at about 6 feet high and 10 feet long, the remnants are significant. But I know that this is a podcast, and you can't see what we're describing. So I interviewed David Duncan of the American Battlefield Trust for further insight, and his description may help you more easily visualize what you can see in this downtown Charleston park.
What people don't know today, based on that one little remnant that you have, it's about the size of I always say it's kind of an overturned commercial refrigerator size, but it was a much, much larger work that spanned several, what would today be blocks within the city of Charleston, right there at Marion Square. Had a very deep ditch dug in front of it so that from the top of the ramparts of the hornwork, which again was constructed out of mostly, oyster shells and sand and what they called it tabby. So from the top to the bottom, you basically had a 30-foot wall that protected the American forces inside the city. It did not change the outcome. The British still were able to besiege the city and compel the Americans, the Patriots, to surrender. But that's a story that I think even most Charlestonians today don't know the full extent of it.
It is lesser known, and back in Marion Square, Dr. Nic Butler provides context as to the original intent with the hornwork's construction.
British military engineers in the 1750s during the French and Indian War came to Charleston and said, well, you've done a good job of protecting the southern part of the town. So if someone came into the harbor and attacked the city, you'd be fine. But we need to protect the back part of the town. And that was why the hornwork was started in 1757.
The hornwork is so named because it's shaped like a horn.
Yeah, so it's shaped like what you'd see in many other European or even American cities where there's a fortification that's designed to protect the entrance towards the town from the countryside. So you've got a flat face that's perpendicular to the path, which is King Street, and then a projecting horn on the east and on the west, like the horns of a bull. And that's where the origin of the name came from.
It's kind of wild to think about that there's this massive structure that was here, and now we have this small bit that's left. Right. How do we even get this, though?
Well, it's miraculous that this piece of tabby has survived over the centuries, because in 1784, the newly incorporated city of Charleston said, we don't need that hornwork anymore. It's blocking traffic into Charleston. So it was knocked down. Enslaved people with sledgehammers were paid to knock this stuff down, except this one part that appears to have been used as some kind of a garden fence, like a partition fence. What we now call Marion Square, this park, its public park, was once subdivided into rental lots by the city of Charleston. And there were a number of houses built here in the late 18th and early 19th century. So this was part of somebody's back garden back in the day. And that's the only reason it survived. And the fence has been there since the 1880s. And generations of people have come and looked at that and wondered what it was, because there's not great signage on it. But we're trying to do a better job of telling the story of the hornwork and the Siege of Charleston and South Carolina's role in the American Revolution.
How important was South Carolina in the American Revolution?
Well, South Carolina is very important to the overall national strategy of the young United States. And, most of the action that people are familiar with took place up in the northern colonies. But in the latter stages of the war, in 1778, 79, and 1780, and even after the city of Charleston was captured in 1780, there's an awful lot of action. There are at least 200 skirmishes and battles of some kind or another in the state of South Carolina. British capture of Charleston in 1780 was a massive loss to the American cause, but it really did help galvanize the people who were not within the city, out in the countryside, to band together and to resist. And that resistance in the Southern campaign of 1781, 1782 really culminated and came together at Yorktown, Virginia in late 1781.
We walk closer to the remnants of the hornwork, and Dr. Butler tells me that where we're walking would have once been a moat. All under where we're standing right now, we would be having this massive fortification.
Right, so we're walking across the foundation of this massive hornwork that takes up about 10 acres overall. And this is just one small piece of a much, much, much larger structure. It's really hard to get an idea of it, but this wall in the time of the American Revolution would have been 12 to 15 feet high, and there would have been a moat directly in front of it. So we're standing in the moat in front of the hornwork. This is what the British would have seen as they were approaching Charleston in the spring of 1780.
So do you think they would have thought, wow, we can't mess with this city, or how can we get around this, or what do you think that was going through their head as they were approaching?
Well, the British were professional engineers, and this was nothing compared to some of the fortifications they had seen in Holland and in France, so I don't think they were particularly intimidated. But this was really one of the most significant of the American fortifications of the entire war, and most Americans have forgotten all about it.
Interesting. But why build a fortress out of oyster shells? I've traveled through Europe, so I've seen some of those ancient forts. But this is also very interesting because you think about where we are in South Carolina, and you think about what the resources are and what's really available. And we have this amazing seafood, and we have these awesome oysters. So we've got this oyster shell fortification.
Right. It's very practical. There's no natural stone in this area at all. And bricks are expensive and they take a long time to make. But if you use the naturally abundant oyster shells, then you've got a ready-made concrete. So this is an 18th century kind of concrete that the English probably learned it from the Spanish and the Caribbean. So you gather oyster shells, and they would have been taking some of those oyster shells and grinding them up into aggregate, just like gravel is used in modern concrete. And some of those oyster shells would have been cooked right here on site in big fires to produce powdered lime, and add water and sand and wood ash, and you've got a slurry that you can pour into a mold. And actually, if you look at the structure, you can still see some evidence of the construction technique. So they start by pouring a foundation, and they dug almost 10 feet down to start the foundation of this thing. And then they're putting forms on the side and a dowel connecting the boards on each side. And as the oyster shell cement dries, they pull out the dowels and remove the forms, and then when it's solid, they put the forms back on and start over again. So if we look and see, some of these dowel holes are part of the construction technique. Some of these might be bullet holes or cannon shot from the siege of 1780.
Iconic history is around every corner. Located by the Old Exchange and Provost Dungeon on East Bay Street, the Tavern at Rainbow Row touts itself as the oldest liquor store in America, which Dr. Nic Butler says is... You don't think so?
No, it was built in 1783.
Okay.
The building was definitely built in 1783 because it caused a lawsuit.
Interesting. Okay, we're debunking history here with Nic. That's great. What else would daily life have been like for people that were constructing this fortress and just during that time period in general?
When construction started on the hornwork in the autumn of 1757, the original labor force were regular British soldiers who were actually working in 2 shifts. So 12-hour days, 100 men working 6 hours, and then another 100 men coming in and working for 6 hours. And they're camped in this area because there's a lack of barracks in Charleston at the time. There's a quartering crisis, as in Boston, and in New York. So they're camped here, they're eating, they're cooking, and they're working on this site. So after about 3 or 4 months, the British regulars were recalled because all the action at that time in the late 1750s was up in New York and in Canada. And so an enslaved labor force came in the spring of 1758 and finished the rest of the hornwork. So for the next year, you've got 50 to 80 enslaved men who are working every day here on the hornwork. Many of them probably camped here as well, so laboring from sunup to sunset. So construction started in late 1757, and in April of 1759, the South Carolina government pulled the plug on this project because by that time it became abundantly clear the French were not going to sail into Charleston Harbor. All of the real action was going on up in Canada, and the British were winning. So funding was cut for this project, and the hornwork was left unfinished. But in that 18 months of construction, they did a massive amount of work, and it cost about 10,000 pounds in South Carolina currency at that time. It's really hard to determine what that is, but it was a lot of money. So in the American Revolution, the Americans basically just had to dust off the unfinished hornwork and put a little bit more money and effort into it with the help of French engineers, and it was completed and enclosed as a citadel during the Siege of 1780.
At many sites that have history, sometimes it's difficult to really visualize it, which is where the American Battlefield Trust is coming in with other partners
If you go to Marion Square now, there's some new interpretive signs in the ground that tell you a little bit more about the hornwork, but very exciting for the part that's within the park. We've actually installed in-ground markers, they're circular, that show the footprint and the outline of the hornwork as it stretched across Marion Square, so that you can literally now go, whereas a year ago it was purely speculative, now you can go and walk through the park, read a little bit about the history of the hornwork as well too, and walk in the footprint of that fortification. That's all great, but for me, the best is yet to come. That hopefully a little bit later this summer, I mentioned before about how we're trying to move interpretation into the 21st century. We're looking to install some in-ground binoculars in Marion Square. And I'm sure people have gone to historic sites in the past, and the old ones used to put a quarter in and it would let you see things that were far away up close. Well, these binoculars are different. They don't bring anything closer to you, but they allow you to see back into time. Because when you look through these binoculars, you're going to see an augmented reality presentation of the hornwork. So you'll be able to get a sense of its size and scale as you pan around Marion Square. And Darley, I swear I would be very surprised if people aren't lined up around the block to get their chance to look through this thing once we get it installed. So that's the type of thing we hope. We want people to be excited about history and learn things that they never knew before. So we're very, very excited about all that's happening there at the Hornwork in Charleston.
This isn't the only location where new technology will help visitors explore the past.
We're doing it at another Liberty Trail site called Fort Fairlawn, again, where, on your phone, you'll be able to download an app and take it with you and look around the fort. We've actually put soldiers from the period into the augmented reality, reconstructed it based on historical research, so that not only you're standing there in the present time, obviously, but you're looking through your device, as you say, into a window into the past.
After you discover Marion Square, head just across the street to Rag Square. I'm taking a walk with director of the Charleston Museum, Carl Borick, to further contextualize the Southern campaign during the American Revolution.
So we're here in Rag Square, and Rag Square was established in the early part of the 19th century, but 20 years prior to that, it was the focus of the Siege of Charleston. Major part of the American defense line ran through here. The Siege of Charleston was the largest battle fought here in South Carolina during the Revolutionary War, and it was also the longest siege of the Revolutionary War, longer even than the Siege of Yorktown. So Charleston really it gives the British overconfidence to go into the backcountry, and it really is the catalyst by which they ultimately meet defeat in the Southern campaigns of the Revolutionary War.
Significant history that you can walk through in downtown Charleston. And if you want to chart other locations related to the American Revolution on your trip, there are lots of options, including the Old Exchange and Provost Dungeon, the Charleston Museum, the Hayward Washington House, and there are sites beyond Charleston along the Liberty Trail, which you can learn about by watching our episodes of Travels with Darley on PBS and streaming entitled Charleston and the Liberty Trail and South Carolina Revolutionary Road Trip Part 1 and 2. And look for information on battlefields.org and by downloading the Liberty Trail app in the App Store. Now, most importantly, where to eat. Have dinner at the grocery. Or head for oysters at the Darling Oyster Bar or Leon's Oyster Shop. And don't forget to get a hot little biscuit from Callie's Hot Little Biscuit. Combining history and great food on a trip makes for a win, especially in my home state of South Carolina. I'm Darley Newman, and thanks so much for listening to my podcast. And if you like this and want more, please subscribe.